My name is Carlene Lagrou, and I'm going to be your instructor for the next hour. Hopefully, you stick with me, and we're going to be doing a watercolor today, and this is what you're going to paint. It's a lily, and we're going to do a very loose background. You're not going to have hardly any detail. It's just going to be what you see, and then we're going to paint the flower. This will include dry technique and a wet on wet. So I'll do a demonstration of both before we do the picture. And if you want to paint along, put a pause and do a drawing. You can download it from the Art Center if you want after the program, because they have a copy of the drawing and you can download it if you want to paint it later. We're going to start with an introduction here. This video is being sponsored by the Michigan Council for the Arts and Cultural Affairs and the National Endowment for the Arts. And we really appreciate them doing this and keeping the arts alive in the United States and especially in small towns like we're in now in Gaylord. So we want to make sure that they get all the credit they deserve. Okay, we're going to start now. And I'm going to do some basics here for anyone who is a beginner. And if you want, if you have some experience, you can start putting a small sketch in. You know, this is an organic thing, so you don't have to worry about having everything perfect. You can make really any kind of flower you want if you want to paint along, and it would be pretty much the same. All right, so wet on wet, you're using a lot of water with your paper. So I think I'll use a big one. So when you're doing the wet on wet, you take your paper in your brush and you just put clean water. Then you can take, if you can see that, can they see the paper? You can take any color. This is just to show you how the wet on wet works. While I have this puddle of water up here, I can just drop paint on and it spreads. That is wet on wet, and I can do that. And it's also a really good way of learning what your paint does. How the colors match, how they mix with each other. If I put a darker red in next to it, that's how it blends. And this is a really nice way of mixing your paint on your paper rather than on the palette. It normally will come out more transparent and fresher looking. So that's wet on wet. And then this would be a dry brush. So I'm applying the paint directly on the paper, and you can see there's no blossoming, there's no blending. So those are basically the two major ways you're going to paint with watercolor. Now we have, you know, I'm going to do a little bit of, when you buy your brushes, just for your own general knowledge, if you've never painted watercolor before, brushes are expensive. You can buy really expensive ones, or you can get the synthetic, which work really good and which I would recommend for beginners. So maintenance on your brushes. When you put the paint on, you know, and you apply the paint and you're finished, always clean your brush before you go to another color, because you're going to get it contaminated. You don't want to mix one color with the other, and then you're never going to have a fresh color when you go to paint if you do that in your palette. Let me show you. I don't know if you can see this. This is my palette, and you can see if I'm using red and I don't clean my brush and I want a little bit of green, that red's going to go in there, and you're going to have mud eventually. It's going to be useless. You're going to have to clean it out and get rid of it. So it's important to do that. And the second thing for the life of your brushes is to always clean them when you're finished painting, clean water, let them dry, and set them flat to dry. If you put them in a canister like you see in videos and movies and you set them up in a container, the water goes down into the ferrule and it'll eventually loosen and your bristles will fall out. So if you want to keep your brushes for a while, clean them, lay them flat to dry. Once they're dry, you can put them, store them any way you want. Okay, paper. And if you're buying, you know, if you find you really enjoy this and you want to buy some supplies and equipment, it's best to invest in the paint. If you're going to buy the best paint that you can afford, you know, the really basic beginning paint doesn't have a lot of pigment in it. So you're never going to get this bright red, fresh color or any color. So buy at least a medium grade paint. And you can work your way up to the expensive stuff. So when you get to be a Van Gogh or a Gauguin or someone. So that would be my choices. The second choice would be your paper. You want to buy, this is a rag. It's 140 cold press arches. It comes in big sheets, which you can cut down to standard sizes. This is a quarter sheet. So the sheets come 22 by 30 inches. So you want to, and you can still cut this down if you want. You can buy them in blocks, but the blocks are normally more expensive and they're glued together and they're flat. You can buy a lot of paper. The difference between a rag and a paper mat is made from wood pulp. So it's not as durable. This has cotton fibers in it. So I can scrub on that. I can run it under my, and I have on a full painting, I've run them in my bathtub and rinsed it off. And you can almost come down to the white paper, let it dry, and start your work again. When you do something, you say, oh, I really hate that. Ugh. So it's really workable and you can change things. If you're using wood pulp paper, it'll shred. You can't do what you can to the rags. So keep that in mind too. It's a little more delicate and it accepts the paint differently. So once you get going, you know, certainly buy the inexpensive papers to start with. But once you start doing something, you say, gee, I might like to save this, or I'm going to give it as a gift, or I'm going to enter a competition, or, you know, you just need a better surface to work on, then invest in the better papers. Okay, and the third thing with working with watercolor, it's always nice to have something to put it on, you know, a good foundation. They sell all kinds. You can buy, I have for the big sheets, I just buy wood from the lumber store, have it cut it to the size of the papers. I have several different sizes. And you can either staple it on or tape it on. If it's a smaller size like this or this, I normally don't staple or tape because I like moving my paper a lot. And the bigger the sheet you get, and if you have a full size sheet to fill it, you can clip the edges and just keep, you know, making sure it's straight. Because when you use a lot of water, because this is watercolor, your paper will buckle. So, you know, it's going to move, it's going to stretch with the water. So you want to be able to keep it flat. This will help if you have a good straight board underneath. It will help keep it flatter and stable. So, and also, you know, when I'm doing watercolor, I move it a lot. So it's nice to have something that I can move and keep the water still. Okay, we'll start now. I'm going to show you the finished product. This is what I'm working from. And it's a water lily. And the background is very loose. It was done wet on wet. So when you do it, you pretty much let it dry a little bit before you start working on your subject. And you can work on your subject matter first or your background. You know, and I do both. So it doesn't matter which one you start with. It's kind of like an individual kind of thing. Whatever makes you feel good. Now, this was wet on wet. This is another one. And this was all done wet on wet. All the background. It wouldn't be as vibrant here. That was my initial wash, the top part. I put the blues and the yellows for the light first. I kept this dry, and you can bring your sky down, you know, when you're doing that wet on wet, because you're going to be painting over that. It's light. You start 90% of the time. As soon as I say this, someone's going to say, oh, no, I do it different. But the basic thought on watercolors, you start with your lightest color first, and then you work it up to the darkers. So this light color you can drag down in here, and you'll have a more of a natural edge when you're working on your darker colors. Here, I kept the paper dry so the paint wouldn't bleed into it. As long as that paper is wet, that's never good either. Okay, as long as the paper is wet, that paint will bleed into each other. And I'll show you what I mean. I'm just going to give this a little spurts. And these are all when you're painting anything. These are all good things to know. So I have a wet spot here, and I put my wet down here. You can see how it's going to bloom. So if I want to make a hard edge, I would keep that. There's my water end there. Now you can see where the paint won't bleed, where the paper is dry. So you want to know that if you're doing like on the flower, if I'm doing the background first, I want to keep all this where the flower is dry, or that background blue will just bleed into it slowly. So there's two ways you can do it. You can either paint around it very carefully, or you can use a product that is, what's the name of it?
Frisket.
Frisket. There's a couple different names for it, but Frisket is one. It's like a gum, and you put it on, and it keeps that paper dry, and it keeps the paint from bleeding into it. And then when where you painted is really dry, you can rub it off, and that is pure white underneath. That's one way of preserving whites anywhere in a painting. If you're doing a street light and you want that circle to be perfect, you can use. See if I can get it to stand. You can use white paint, but traditionally, white paint is frowned upon in watercolor. If you're entering competitions, and it's a transparent watercolor competition, if you use white paint, you'd be disqualified. You just lose your spot. So, but that's a technicality right now we don't have to worry about. All right, so on this one, I did frisk out my flowers to do the background, but for time-wise, because that takes a lot longer, we're not going to do that. We're going to paint around it carefully. So you just take a big brush. Use a big brush, and that's another thing. Learn what your brushes will do. I can have this big brush, and I can do, you think everybody wants to pick up this brush and paint the background. Can you see painting that background? That won't work. You use a big brush. Be generous with that paint. Okay. So I forgot what I was going to do. All right. So on this background, we're going to put a lot of water, and we're going to paint around these edges carefully. Now there's several things. See how all this? First I dropped in. So this is a technique I'll show you now. So when you're doing it, you can think about it. So I can throw in a little paint here and there and let it run around. So I have some blues and I have other colors in there. And you take a spray bottle. Always check to see what's coming out of your spray bottle too, because you don't want too fine, or if somebody turns a little nozzle on you, you get a hard spray, and that's going to make a difference. Now, the other thing, it's really, I like to keep a rag here to blot up extra water and a sponge from my water. So, you can control how much water you have in your brush. Okay, so I have that red on there, and I'm going to throw in another color. Let's just throw in a little of the Cobalt Blue. So I'm just going to do that. Now, you can see how it's drying here a little bit on this patch. And all I did was this with the spray bottle. You just want to make sure you know what's coming out of that bottle. You don't want a hard spray. You don't want a soft spray. And they do make smaller bottles just for these kind of things too. But, you know, I find that this works good because I can adjust the spray. I can have a hard stream. I can have a soft stream. And, you know, the spray bottle is kind of like a little miracle thing. Watercolor works really good with watercolor, so you got to keep that in mind. Now, see that hard spray? I can take that hard spray if I'm doing water or anything where you want a line in the paint, the water, the paper cleaner. I can take that hard spray and make a water. And so if you can see that on a lake, you'd have your silver streak. And I think Nita Ingle coined that term, silver streak. So there's a lot of things you can do. I mean, watercolor is probably a little more difficult of a medium to use, but once you learn how to manipulate it, it's you're gonna love it. It's just a beautiful medium. It's luscious. You can see the colors. There's another one, and that was on a different kind of paper. But it's a great medium, so you'll really enjoy it. Now, the other important housekeeping thing that I forgot earlier was where you keep your supplies when you're painting. I'm right-handed, so here's my paper. Right next to my paper, on my right, because I'm right-handed, is my palette. And I keep my colors clean. If you dip in by mistake, just you can take your rag or your sponge and pick in that odd color. I keep that there. I keep my water buckets on the right. And that's only because it saves you time and you won't make the, like if you're painting, I'm painting here, so I'm coming directly to my paper. If I had to go and dip my water into my left, I'm more likely to get a spatter or something that's dripping off where I don't want it. It just makes your whole process of painting easier. And that it doesn't matter if you're doing acrylics, oils, watercolors, pastels, anything. If you're right-handed, keep all your supplies on the right. If you're left-handed, on the left. It just makes your life easier and less likely to make an error. Okay, so I think we beat that to death. Let's move on to our flower. Like I said, I like keeping everything on a movable board because if you use your tabletop, you can't move your paper around at all. You're stuck there. So when I'm doing this, and I do move my paper a lot to paint, I don't always keep it this way. I move everything quite often. So it just makes your life easier, and anything that can make your painting easier, go for it. All right, and I'm going to move that out of my way so I don't have anything here. So I'm going to start on my painting now. And I'm going to try and control it to a little bit of an area so I don't take hours to do this, because if I were working on something at home, that would probably have taken me maybe 2-3 hours, maybe longer, maybe shorter, but I'm estimating there. And a lot of drying time in between. A lot of watercolor is manipulating the paint and then letting it dry and step back. I can't tell you how good it is when you're at a certain point to get up and walk away and come back and look at your work, and you'll have fresh eyes. It'll look all different. So, all right. I'm just going to take a lot of water, and I'm going to start just going around with clean water here. And you can see how I'm just going around, and I'm just going up to my drawing. So when I put the paint on here, my flower will stay white. So I'm going to use a lot of paint. And I take my paint, when I take it out of the well, I normally do this just to make sure I have all the pigment. There's no blobs of pigment that you get in there. Then you get a dark streak, and you don't want that. You want to have that nice and fluid. So now it's, see how nice it just kind of goes around, does its own little thing. And as long as that paper is wet, I can keep adding anything I want. You have to stop at a certain point or you lose your transparency. But as long as I keep it moist, I can add more pigment. I can make it as dark as I want. And the one other thing that's kind of nice to know is watercolor dries a lot lighter than when you put it on. So all this will look a lot lighter when it's dried. So don't worry if you look at it and you say, oh man, too much paint. Don't worry about it. Because you can always pick it up. You saw what I could do with that spray bottle. And that just goes on forever like that. So I'm just going to keep going around and getting this done. And hopefully you're doing this with me. So while this is wet, you can watch what I'm going to do. Because I do want to add some different colors here and there. I want to add a little green here and there. So I'm going to take my green, and I'm just going to use a different brush so I can keep my blue paint in this one. And I'm just going to add a little green here and there so it gives it a little bit of life. It's going to give it another element to look good. All right. So now I'm going to keep going with the blue, and I can add more green later. I'm going to make a border here, and we're going to stop there. So we have a beginning and an end. And it's always nice whether you do it on your paper and you leave a dry spot, or if you just put a piece of scrap next to your work, so that when you're saying, okay, what color would I want to blend with this? You can pick that up. I can say, okay, I have my blue. What's green going to do? Okay, that's what green does. And I have this as a sidebar, a scrap. Let's try a little orange. See what happens to that blue. Do I want to put orange on? So it's always nice to either keep a scrap paper so you can test your colors, so you know what you're putting on before you put it on your paper and go, oh my God, that was a mistake. Whoo. So this makes it a little easier. Okay, I'm going to pick up more pigment here, because I want a nice dark. The darker you make your background, there are two ways to make white stand out, like the white flower. You either make your background darker or you use line. You go in with a little drawing. And you can do that drawing with your paint. You don't have to do it with your brush. You don't have to do it with a pencil or... And I'm moving this around because I don't want to have any hard lines. Well, now I can stop here because I want to keep that paper dry. But if you, once that paper starts dry, if I pick it up, it won't look fluid anymore. So now I have basically half of it done. I'm going to put my paint there. I'm going to take my spray. Yeah, see? I wouldn't want to do that. It's hard. It's always best to check. Perfect. Now, and I'm going to take a piece of paper so I don't get it on my flower. And I'm just going to squirt that a little bit to get that texture. Now, when that dries, it's going to have, so you can already see the paint moving around. Now, at this point, if I tilt my paper, that paint will move. So if you don't want your paint to move on you to another area, you keep it laying flat and it'll dry just like that. But this way I could make my paint move around and blend it a little more even. Can you see that? And up here, let's put a little more paint. I want that a little darker yet. Okay, you can see how it's drying lighter. So I'll just keep adding until I like it. And we can spray it one more time. And at different times when you put it on your paper, when you spray, it's going to be When it gets a little drier, you get more pronounced blossoms. And the blossoms are here. You can see what I'm talking about. This would be a blossom when I sprayed it with the water. See, those are all from little droplets of water. So at different times as your paint is drying, you get different shapes and more blossoms or less blossoms or blending. So that's kind of a thing you just kind of have to work with too. And, you know, I always say when you take a workshop or you listen to a video, don't expect to come out with a masterpiece right away. 5 years from now, 3 months, 6 months, 2 days, you're going to do something and you're going to say, oh my God, that's what that woman was talking about. So don't expect to have those bells ringing immediately. So I am getting a couple little drops of paint here. And you can just take your paper towel, Kleenex. Cheap toilet paper works great because you really don't want to use expensive hand towels or any of this because they put lanolin in them, and that can sometimes repel the paint. If you have a really good paper towel that has, you know, that softness and it feels good, then it has some oil in it, some cream, especially Kleenex when you use it. It's like, ooh. So you want to buy, you know, just get it for your paint, a little less expensive, and it won't have all those fillers in it to make it soft and pretty. Okay, so I'm moving along here pretty good. And it helps because I've done this one before. I've done it there, so it's a little easier. Whenever I'm doing something for the first time, it takes longer. But I know what to expect. I know what I want. And that's the other thing. When you're preparing your artwork, you know, it's better to take time and plan it. So you know where you're putting your paint. You know where your drawing is going to be. And I think they're going to have a drawing video, so you'll get more information on that too. Do you know if they're going to have a drawing video, Joe?
I believe they are, yeah.
Yeah, so you'll have that. But you know, it's important to do your sketches. It's important to do your time in on that kind of thing, so you know what to expect when you get it on your paper. So I'm going to make my boundary here. And watercolor is such a beautiful color. And traditionally, in the old days, in the Renaissance and, you know, before the Renaissance, watercolor was used as more of a sketching medium because it's, well, the paints are I think, made with a little more stability now than they had. But it fades in the light. If you get strong lights on a painting, like, you know, when they show oils all the time in museums and that, the reason you never see watercolors is because they're a little more delicate. If you don't have all the, you know, the right papers and the right paints and, you know, the quality, you're going to lose your vibrancy. You're going to lose your bright colors. So that's the reason that if you see a watercolor show in a museum, the lights will come on and off when you go in that gallery. When people leave, the lights go off just to keep those paints on the watercolors fresh. And even at that, it's amazing when you see a watercolor done by Rembrandt or, you know, any of the old masters, and that they still are viable. But that's because they haven't been, you know, they're stored in the dark in the museums. Now the paints are made with more stability, so you can have them out. So you can see why it's nice to have a board and you can move things around. If I'm doing a bigger piece and I have it stapled to it, I normally staple, I don't tape. And it's a little harder moving it around. I have to keep my table pretty empty. But I do move things around because it just makes your life easier. All right. So let's see if we can, how this will work now for me. I'm gonna spray it again, but let's put a little, whoops, get away. Put a little more up here, a little more color. And once I do this, if I let this paper dry, I can do this all over again if I want it darker. I can do this whole process, wet it down very gently and let it dry. So what I'm doing here is I'm keeping that flower dry so my paint doesn't spread into it. I'm keeping that, and you can see, how nice all that is beginning to get texture. And that's just clear water. I can take, if I'm doing something really big and I want this effect, I take my little bottles and I put, well, it's about 1.5 inches, but it's 1.5 inches squeezing out of the tube, the paint coming out. Put it in there and then double that with water and shake it up good, and you can spray color on too. For doing texture and sand, it's too hard in the class. For doing texture and sand on pavement, on, you know, a lot of things, you get that spray and it's the color. And you want a fine spray for the most part. You don't want to have it a heavy spray, because then you might as well just use your brush. So there's a lot of these little things, but the thing you have to remember, every time I tell you one of these things you can do, don't do it on everything all the time. There's certain things it works on, and then it can get overkill and look kind of trendy. You want to keep it more of a classic kind of watercolor, unless of course you're doing something trendy. You know, you want to keep those colors real. You want to keep, and I'm looking around here, but I think it'd be too hard to move the camera. Maybe at the end of this, we can show examples of the paintings in the gallery here, and what works and what doesn't work. This is right now we have a show up, so it's all really good. But okay, now this is really, I should let dry a minute. So I'll be back in 20 minutes. It's pretty dry, so I can start working on this without worrying about it bleeding into the background. I'm going to move to a smaller brush now because we're going to be doing the petals, and it's just easier with a smaller brush. Okay, so I'm going to start. I'm just going to wet the petals with water. I'm not going to have any color on it yet, and we'll start back here. Now what I'm going to do is don't get any on the blue. You want to keep that blue dry now, or it will start bleeding into it. So we're just going to go right around the edges, and I am going to even keep each petal separate. I'm going to keep a little halo around each petal of dry water. So I'm going to do a couple petals at a time here, get them wet, and then I'll add the paint. So just be careful how you're doing it. And keep a little bit of a dry edge, just a little between each petal and the background. All right, so I've got those two on there, so I'm going to take a little bit of the blue that I've been using, and I'm going to put a little bit of Paynes Gray in it just to give it a little darker color. And I'm just going to drop it in places where it would be a shadow. And I'm going to only, and I'm going to do a petal at a time here, so it's going to take a little longer. Now, it's important to keep the lower petals dry because you don't want them getting, and you can kind of do this so it blends. I'm going to clean my brush and soften all these edges. Okay, so now remember that this is going to dry lighter too. It's not going to be that dark. I'm going to take a little bit of yellow ochre, water it down good. And I'm just going to put a little bit on the tip here and there where, petals start to yellow here and there once in a while. And you're not going to do it everywhere because you don't want that to... You don't want it to take over, and you don't want every petal to be exact. So you're gonna change it up every time you go. All right, let's wet a couple more. I'll just go in and do the back ones.
So even though it's a white lily, you're adding quite a bit of color.
Yeah, you're gonna know it's white. It's you can't look at anything that's white and say, wow, that's white. Because I can look at every one of these paintings on the wall. The mats are the white. They're all different whites. They're, some will have a little gray, some will have a little yellow, some will have a little of everything. So, yeah, it'll read as white when it's done. If you just wanted to leave it light, it's like a hole in the paper. You can see it's just like a big hole in the middle of the paper. It's so stark white. So now it has a life to it. Okay, let's go. Let's do this one here. And as we leave these beads of dry paper between the petals, we'll be able to paint them all because we won't have to dry in between as long as we're careful not to. And that's one benefit to leaving that little bead of dry paper. All right, so we have those two. I'm gonna use that same blue. Put that there. I'm gonna put a little green here and there too in this. Because when petals are first opening and starting, sometimes they have green. All right, so, and I think I'm going to add just a little green in here too. A spot here and there. And when this dries, you can always add more or pick it up. I'll show you how to pick up your paint. Because in places we'll even want a little bit stronger color yet. Okay, I'm going to go do the whole back here, and you can look at the front there. I know sometimes watching people paint is probably like watching paint dry, which is slow.
But you learn a lot watching somebody else paint.
Yeah, I'm a real visual painter. I can read something and I'll have to read it 5 times, but I'll have to try it out before I get it. It's like, if I can see somebody do it, it's much easier than if I read how to do it. And, you know, you could wet as many petals as you want. If I were, but why I'm doing 2 or 3 at a time is because I can tell how it's drying, and that way the flower will be more uniform.
And you're basically using colors that are already in your background.
Yeah. When you pick your palette, you know, that's you know, when you, if you're at a class or you're at, you know, someone put up a still life, they put that still life up very carefully. They did it because the colors will all go with each other, and they should be used through the whole painting. Every time you deviate from something like that, you know, think carefully about what effect you want and where you're going to put that color. So in this painting, it's predominant. How do you say that? Predominantly blue and green. I'll get it. But you know, so you have to know that if you add a strange color into something like this, if I put a dab of any other color in here, it better work. I better think about it real carefully. That's why I have this. Oh, and by the way, you know, I'm trying to see if I can. See how nice these colors blended and the wet and wet? If I had done them all dry brush, they would have been hard, straight lines. Now all those edges are blurred and the color just blends beautifully. It's much better than you trying to, if you put it on your palette and you went, let's say, okay, here's my, you go on it, and I'm going to have to clean it up because it makes mud. Okay, so here, whoops, I have my blue and I have my green and I have that yellow ochre I'm using. So I am mixing this paint on my paper. All this is mixed on the paper, not on my palette. So if I wanted to, and I have this, and I'd say, okay, I want to put a little blue and green in here. So I have my blue and I have my green. Let me clean my brush. If I would do that, here's my blue, here's my green, blue and green. It's a much deader color than this, where I applied it individually and let it bleed on its own. Look at the difference between this green, blue, and there. That it changes the composition. So instead of having those beautiful blends, I have that. So, and there are times I want that, so I'll mix it on my palette. But in cases like this where the flower is luminescent and it's got that little bit of especially in whites, you don't want that hard thing thrown in. So I let the green and the blue just work its way into each other, and it comes out a much more delicate color, and you can see the light of the paper coming through better than there. This makes it changes it to maybe a little more opaque instead of all transparent. But you can see how this is still transparent, letting it mix by itself on the paper. All right, back to the painting. All right, where did we leave off? And when, you know, by the time I get all these petals done, I can come back here and darken or lighten any of those because they'll be dry by the time I get there. And they get bigger as we go down, so they go faster. And you know, if I'm doing, you know, a really big painting and I've got a lot of pigment I'm using, like now I've cleaned my brushes, so I'm not using a lot of pigment on this. You have to change your water once in a while because it just, I have to clean this up so it's all the same. I want to get rid of that blue and green mixture that I don't want on my palette at the moment. And it's good to clean your palette every once in a while. You know, wipe that paint off if it bleeds together because you're going to get that drab color. So always, you know, try and be aware of is it changing on me. And what I'm doing where I'm applying this blue is shadows are inherently blue. So I'm putting that blue where the petal is overlaying the other petal. These petals are in front, so I'm going to get a little bit of a shadow behind those petals. So you know, I'm just not putting that paint anywhere. So it's going to look like those petals are laying on top of each other, not. And I'll be painting the front ones a little different, where there's no. I'm going to put a little green at the base of this too. And they always have that little light from the sun. So we're going to give this one a little light right here. And we're going to give this one a little light right there. It's picking that up beautifully. Can you see the sun? It's out there shining. It's a beautiful day out there today.
Lots of shadows going on.
Yeah. And the breeze is blowing. All right, let's wet this one here. Get this one out of the way. How are you doing there, Joe?
I bet it doesn't look like yours, but it's progressing.
Well, we'll show it when it's done.
Oh, great.
And anybody who says they can't paint, you're wrong.
It's true.
Give it a shot. It may take you a while. Don't expect to be a pro in 20 minutes. And I'm using the shadow paint very light on the pigment. It's very light on the pigment. I'm not using a lot at all. Okay, here's a good thing. See, I just put that on where it's dry. See those hard edges and see how it blends when it's wet. And that's the point of wet on wet. You get these very soft blended edges. If I'm doing the dry, it gets a harder edge. But I'm going to be putting some of those harder edges in here when they're dry anyway. So I thought I'd just show you one or two. And even at that, let's do that now. I'm going to even put a little more color because orange happens to be my favorite color. What can I say? I don't wear it well, but I love the color. I saw a new orange Jeep.
Oh, no.
Oh, it was so cute. One of my neighbors got a new Jeep. And it's like it's kind of like an old-fashioned pickup truck. That was just so cool. And he had it in this orange. I stopped and I told him how much I love it, and he was so flattered. He looked so happy to have someone like his Jeep. And he said it's a new one they're just coming out with, I think last year he said, in the orange color. Okay, but now see how that orange brightens up that yellow just a little bit, just a hair of it. It's a color you want to add a little sparingly, but it just adds a lot to the painting. So keep that in mind. Always, and you know, and if you're not sure, try it on your side here. And the other thing is, if I decide I don't like that orange, I can pick it up later and get rid of it. I use my hands a lot too. And so I don't think you ever see an artist with a manicure. Ever. So and I'm not going to put it on everything. I'm just going to add it sparingly here and there. And if I don't like it, I can pick it up. I can change it. All right, let's move on to the next one now. So are you all falling in love with watercolor now? You are, aren't you?
Yes, we are.
Good. And the way the background is, and you can see some of my pencil lines from the you know, you're going to see some of them. And I don't mind that at all. If you don't like to see any pencil lines, you just do your drawing very lightly. You know, use a very a harder pencil. And the other thing I have to say, one of the things that you do want to do some drawings and know what you're going to put on your paper before you start. You don't want to erase on watercolor paper too often because it has a tooth to hold the paint. And if you erase on it a lot, you're going to damage the fabric of the paper. It's gonna accept the paint differently. So when you put that paint on, you're gonna have darker. Where you bruise the paper, it's gonna be darker. So you want to keep that as little erasing as possible. You don't want to have it and I don't care how often you take a class or anything, you're going to hear a lot of the same things, but it's always good to hear them. Reviewing is never a bad thing. And the other thing you have to remember too, whenever you take a workshop or listen to a video from other artists, you're going to hear some whole new theories. They won't all be the same. Everybody won't agree on, you know, matters, because different things work for different people. Everybody's going to have their own point of view for different things. And that's a good thing. That's why there's so many different variations of art forms and why you'll see so many different styles. This is traditional painting. So what I'm doing here is like what the old masters would have done. They would have done it with, you know, sparing the white of the paper rather than white paint. And as soon as I said that, I've seen Homer, I've seen Whistler use white paint on their watercolors. You can see their pencil lines. You can see white paint. You can see everything. Whatever makes your painting work, use it. If you say, I really like it except for that, fix it any way you can. It's all good. And it's just, and you know, the thing about painting is there's really no right and there's no wrong. It's aesthetically what pleases you. If you're happy with it, that's all that matters. Anybody can come by and criticize you, but don't let them bother you. All right, it's beginning to look better, isn't it? All right, we're going to do this one now. And then I stand back and I say, okay, where do I need, when I get this finished, it doesn't mean the painting is finished. It just means that I've got everything down where I want to start. And I might look at it for a day and, you know, I'll leave it out, anything I'm working on, whether it's, you know, any medium, and look at it for a day. I come back and I might change something the next day and the next day and the next day. And another hint, I have a big mirror in my studio. And look at your painting in reverse. And it's just like a magnifying glass for your errors. I don't know what it is, but you can look at that painting in reverse and go, oh my God, I did that? Oh. It's a tear. And don't forget, it's only paper. If you don't like it, you can tear it up and start over the next day. And it's hard to tell a student that, isn't it, Jill?
Yes, but that is something that she says in every class more than once. It's only paper.
It can be torn up.
And I think another important thing that you always tell us is that, you know, it's not a finished product. You're here in this class to learn your techniques and your the way to get a certain look, and that's what it's about, not producing this fine painting. And
Exactly.
and the other thing you've taught us is to do a second painting of the same thing, and to look at that second painting, and it'll go quicker, and it will probably be your favorite of the two you've produced because you're using the techniques you learned.
And then you're more familiar with the subject. The more familiar you are with your subject, you know, the better your painting's going to be. It's just one of those things. If you're copying something, do more than one sketch of it, you know, because your first sketch is going to be very stiff and stilted. And as you go along, they'll get softer and they'll get better and they'll get more fluid and more loose. But the first one normally will not be your best. And there's a number of things that you know, I do if I'm doing a big painting and I want it to be you know, if it's, you know, because watercolor paper and canvases, you know, they're not the most inexpensive things in the world either. So you want to be treat them a little precious. You know, make sure that you know what you want from that. And I'm darkening some of the edges here just to make these petals stand out. And I'm going to drop in a little bit of yellow ochre in here yet too, because that just brightens it up with the orange. I say, don't be afraid to use your hands, your brushes, rags, anything that you can make that painting better with. Have at it. Now, I've worked in frame shops, galleries, taught art history for a bit. Really restrictive. And you learn something from everywhere. And the more you look at other people's work, the more you'll learn. You know, with this pandemic going on, I've been watching a lot of artists that I admire on the computer. And I have a whole bunch of notes. I take notes yet. You know, I'm a big fan of being a student. Whenever you have the opportunity, go see an art show. Go take a lesson. Do anything that you can. Now, right here at the throat, I'm going to blend some of them. I'm going to make some of these just work right together. And I'm going to put a little bit of a lost edge here. You want to have some edges that just blend into your background and kind of like lost and found edges. Maybe right here we'll lose an edge. All right, let's put the stem in. Now I'm to make my green, I'm using a blue in the yellow ochre. I mean to make my green. I said that right because it makes a softer green. Most tube greens are not meant to be used straight on. You want to add something to it because they come out looking not real lifelike. And you can make if I have blue here, if I add yellow, this is cadmium yellow, makes that really nice leafy green. I can make a little bit of an orange leaf if I add a little orange. In nature and trees, you see a lot of this, and it'll end up looking, it'll complement the green beautifully. So it'll end up pretty green. See? You can put the yellow ochre. And you know, play with your paint like this. See what it does. I mean, that makes a great earth color. But all these are more natural than if I took it out of the tube. Now this is here is a straight, this is one of the few greens that I kind of like. It's Skips Green from Cheap Joe's. And that is a beautiful spring green, but you do still have to use a little of something else with it. But that's one green. And then This green I kind of like, but I always put a little something with it, like let's put it with that, and it comes out more lifelike. So any one of these would make great foliage, trees, bushes. So I'm going to do that to my my stem too. I'm just going to do the blues and the greens. And right underneath, it's going to be really dark because that shadow is right there. I'm going to add some darks yet. I'm going to do that, and I'm going to put a little orange in there. Now, see what I mean? I dipped my brush in there with blue on it. Now that orange paint there is no good. You don't want to do that. Bad. So you just kind of got to pick it up. Every once in a while, you know, you lose control and you just go, that's not good. So the next time you put your brush in that orange, it's gonna come out a dirty orange. So I am going to get rid of it. So I'm mixing my orange with my blue, and look at that nice dark I'm getting. I'm going to put a little more blue in now because I want it a little deeper. And so this is my orange and blue mixed. And that's this nice pale blue that I've been using. So now I have a little deeper color. And I want to add it in just some places where those shadows are a little heavier. And the paper is still a little wet, so it should be okay. I've been using quite a lot of water in here, so I'm going to let some of this bleed down. So what I'm doing is just softening the edges. And every time you do a painting, don't expect them to be the same. Every once in a while, someone will say, can you make me one just like that? And, you know, probably not. It's going to be a lot like it, but if you put the two of them together, they're not going to be identical. Which makes it an original, and that's even better. So always think of it that way. So I am softening some edges. Now I'm just doing a little calligraphy here and there. It's, you know, just adding those little bit of changes where you think you need it. And I'm using probably the darkest color now on the flower. I won't use anything darker than this. Let's soften some of these edges now. And you soften an edge just by running some clean water over it. That's easy enough. Are we getting long on time?
Yeah, a little bit.
Okay.
You're doing good though.
Okay, we'll just put a little indication of some veins here and there. We don't want to beat him to death.
Color are you using for the veins? Or?
Just
Oh,
a
good.
mixture of everything I have. So that's pretty much finished. If I look at it tomorrow, now I could even go in and do more in here. I clean up some edges if I want to. And that's pretty much how it's going to end up. So with that, I can't think of anything else. Is there anything you would ask or
No.
pass yours over?
Oh.
There you go. Very nice.
There you
Good
go.
job. Nice, nice, nice. Okay, and then here's my original. So on this one, I did, and I think I will end up doing this on this one too. I did use a little more firm linear, because 2 ways for white background and line. So I did put some lines. So I think when it dries really good, I can do that. But it has to dry really good first, and it's still a little moist all over. And how you can tell it's moist, the back of your hand, if it feels damp, yeah, I mean, even if you feel no wet, if it feels cool, it's probably still a little wet.
You could probably take a hairdryer to it on low.
Yeah,
To help it along.
if you wanted to, but we're running out of time.
Yeah.
So I will probably do a little more linear work when it's really dry, and then that would be it, because that will make each petal stand out a little more. Very nice. See, Joe is a wonderful student. Good job. And thank you for watching. And thank you to the Art Council and everybody who is providing these services for us. That's so nice. It's wonderful. Thank you.